one child, one night, one house full of people who heard nothing. Wiltshire, England, June the 29th, 1860, and the only suspect was 16 years old. Scotland Yard's finest detective staked his entire career on naming the killer. He was right. They destroyed him for it anyway. By the end of this, you will know what really happened inside Road Hill House on that rainy June night. Why a 16-year-old girl carried a secret for 5 long years, and why the most powerful man in that house was never once put in the dock. Wiltshire, 1860. A respectable county, respectable houses, respectable folk who kept their shutters closed and their mouths shut tighter. That summer, something happened behind the walls of Road Hill House that would shake England to its marrow. And the question that haunted every parlor, every courtroom, every newspaper in the kingdom wasn't whether a murder had been done. It was who among the respectable had done it. But here's what's never sat right with me, and what the history books conveniently glossed over. The detective who solved this case, who had the right suspect, the right evidence, and the right instinct from the very first day, was publicly humiliated, professionally ruined, and forced out of Scotland Yard, while the man he suspected of protecting the killer, a man with powerful friends and a very convenient habit of arriving at crime scenes before the police, was never formally questioned. Not once. Room affair that. Room affair indeed. By the time this investigation is done, you will understand not just who killed little Francis Saville Kent, but why the establishment closed ranks around Road Hill House so tightly that the truth took 5 years to claw its way out. And you will understand why, even after a confession was made, in open court, before a judge, certain questions were still buried. Some of them remain buried to this day. Road Hill House, a 3-story gentleman's residence in the quiet village of Road, spelt that way then, in Wiltshire, before they had the decency to rename it Road. The house belonged to one Mr. Samuel Saville Kent, inspector of factories for the Home Office, a man of some standing, some ambition, and, as the village already whispered, some very dodgy private arrangements. Kent had been married before. His first wife, Mary Ann, bore him 10 children over 15 years. By the time Constance, their 9th child, was born in February of 1844, Mary Ann was in wretched health, broken by childbirth, retreating from her own mind. Doctors had declared her, in their delicate Victorian phrasing, weak-minded. Into this unhappy household came a governess. Her name was Mary Drew Pratt. She was 23, vigorous, capable, and, according to at least one member of staff, already creeping into Mr. Kent's chambers while his first wife lay ill in her bed. When Mary Ann Kent died in May of 1852, the house mourned. Mr. Samuel Kent waited 11 months. Then he married the governess. Constance was 8 years old when her mother died, and the woman she'd watched displace her took over the house entire. That wound core never healed, not properly. By June of 1860, Road Hill House held 2 very different families under the same roof. Kent's children by his first wife, including 16-year-old Constance and her 14-year-old brother William, home from their boarding school for the summer, and Kent's 3 young children by his second wife. The favorite among that second brood, the apple of his father's eye, was little Francis Saville Kent, 3 years old, almost 4. He would not live to see 4. The night of the 29th of June, 1860, the weather had been, by all accounts, filthy. Rain, wind, the sort of Wiltshire night that drives honest folk indoors and keeps them there. The Kent household retired as normal. The 2 youngest children, Francis and his sister Eveline, slept in the nursemaid's room, tended by Elizabeth Goff, the family's young, rather attractive nursemaid. Constance and William were in their own rooms in the older part of the house. Somewhere in the dark hours between midnight and dawn, someone moved through Road Hill House. They knew the layout. They knew which doors creaked. They knew how to open a window shutter without sound. They lifted a sleeping child from his cot, a child wrapped in a blanket, and they carried him out of that house and into the wet Wiltshire night. The Morning Post, July the 2nd, 1860. A crime has just been committed which for mystery, complication of probabilities, and hideous wickedness is without parallel at our criminal records. We know not when any event has created so profound a sensation in this neighborhood or excited so general an interest in England. At approximately 7:15 on the morning of the 30th of June, the nursemaid Elizabeth Goff woke to find the child's cot empty. She assumed Mrs. Kent had come in the night and taken him. Mrs. Kent assumed the nurse had already fetched him up. It was some time before the two women compared notes and realized, with the creeping, stomach-dropping dread, that neither one of them had seen that child since 8 o'clock the previous evening. A search began. The household, the garden, the grounds. It was a local man, William Nutt, working outside on the estate, who reached the servants' outhouse first. He saw blood on the stone floor. He opened the privy lid. What he found down there in that darkness, a child, throat cut so savagely he was nearly decapitated, torso slashed, stuffed beneath the seat, would haunt the men who saw it for the rest of their lives. The case the newspapers would call the Great Crime of 1860 had begun. Now, here is the first thing that should strike you as queer. Mr. Samuel Kent, upon learning his son was missing, did not summon the local constable himself. He drove off personally in his carriage to Trowbridge to inform Superintendent Foley, a journey that took time, a journey that left the crime scene in the hands of barely trained local officers for some considerable while. He also, witnesses later recalled, seemed to possess details about the murder that hadn't yet been announced. Details that would only have been known to someone who had seen the body, or to someone who had rather more knowledge of the night's events than a sleeping father ought to possess. Scotland Yard took note, but here is the thing that the local police very nearly buried completely, and that one sharp-eyed magistrate would later drag screaming into the light. On the morning after the murder, the very morning the body was found, local constable Alfred Urch discovered a nightdress, hidden. Inside Road Hill House, he handed it to Superintendent Foley. Foley looked at the staining on the garment and dismissed it. Menstrual blood, he decided, hidden out of a young woman's shame, nothing to do with the matter. He put it aside. That nightdress was never seen again. And the question of whose nightdress it was and what was really on it is a question that will sit at the very heart of this investigation. Remember it. 3 weeks after the murder, Scotland Yard dispatched their finest detective to Road, Inspector Jonathan Wiltshire, a man who had made his name on some of the most complex cases the Yard had ever handled, a man the press called the Prince of Detectives. Wiltshire arrived in Wiltshire, took one look at the household and understood something immediately that the local police had utterly failed to grasp. This was not a crime committed by a stranger. There was no forced entry. The family dog had barely barked, no footprints in the rain-softened garden from outside the grounds. Whoever had taken that child from his nursery bed knew exactly where he slept, knew the layout of that house in darkness, and had moved through it without disturbing a soul. The killer was inside Road Hill House. Wiltshire examined every member of the household, and he kept returning to one thing: a missing nightdress. Constance Kent had submitted her laundry for the week. 3 nightgowns documented. 3 nightgowns in. But the household laundress, a local woman named Sarah Cox, would later testify that she had only received 2 from Constance. 1 nightgown was unaccounted for. Wiltshire had his theory. He believed Constance had worn that nightdress when she carried Francis out of the house, and that it had been stained with blood. He believed she had pulled another clean garment from the laundry basket and submitted it as a replacement, to disguise the shortage. He believed the nightdress Constable Urch had found and Superintendent Foley had dismissed was that very garment. The nightdress that had since vanished. Right, proper blackguard work to have it disappear so neatly. Sarah Cox, laundress, Road, Wiltshire, as recorded in the magistrate's proceedings, July 1860. I have for some time washed for the Kent family. I know Miss Constance's nightgowns well. When I counted the linen that week, I was one short. I mentioned it to the housekeeper. I cannot account for where it went. I have not seen it since. Wiltshire requested and received authority to arrest Constance Kent on the 27th of July, 1860. He was given 7 days to prepare the case. 7 days. What happened in those 7 days is one of the most extraordinary and frankly most infuriating episodes in Victorian criminal history. Samuel Kent hired a barrister for his daughter. Not merely any barrister, a domineering, well-connected barrister who understood that in the absence of a body of evidence beyond one missing nightdress, a nightdress that had by now well and truly disappeared, the case was thin. The magistrates released Constance on bail. The press, who had been sympathetic to the tearful, veiled, seemingly fragile 16-year-old in the dock, turned on Wiltshire with a savagery that was something to behold. The Trowbridge and North Wiltshire Advertiser, July 1860, that this young lady should have been subjected to the degradation of a public arrest. Upon evidence so slight, upon the mere suspicion of a London detective ambitious for distinction, is a thing which right-thinking Englishmen will not quickly forgive. Right-thinking Englishmen. A child is in a privy with his throat cut. A detective who has examined the evidence more carefully than any man alive names the most credible suspect, and the newspapers spend their ink defending the family's good name. Wiltshire returned to London. Within months, he had left Scotland Yard. His career, built over 2 decades of distinguished service, was finished, and the murder of Francis Saville Kent remained officially unsolved. For 4 years, Road Hill House sat in sullen silence. The family moved away from the village in 1861. Constance was sent first to a finishing school, then to a convent school in France. William returned to his boarding school. Elizabeth Gough quietly left the Kent's employ and vanished from the public record. But the whispers never stopped, because even as Constance was the name on most lips, another name had always been circling at the edges. A name with considerably more to lose. A name that no magistrate had ever been bold enough to put to the full scrutiny of a proper examination. Samuel Kent himself. Consider what we know of this man. He had seduced his first wife's governess while that wife lay ill in the next room. He had conducted what the village long suspected was a continuing liaison with the nursemaid Elizabeth Gough, a liaison that, had it become public, would have destroyed him professionally and socially. And then there was this. Samuel Kent drove personally to Trowbridge that morning, rather than sending a servant, rather than summoning local help, and arrived back at the scene appearing to know more about the state of the body than he could reasonably have known. Charles Dickens, a man of no small perceptive ability, is on record as believing the father was guilty, and there was a theory, circulating quietly, never proved, never formally aired, that the murder was committed to silence something the child had witnessed, something that, if revealed, would have brought Samuel Kent's entire respectable life crashing down around his ears. Private letter, Elizabeth Gough to a cousin, undated, reproduced in Bernard Taylor's Cruelly Murdered, 1979. I cannot say more. There are things which must not be spoken. Only be assured that I have told the truth as I know it, and that the truth in that house was not a simple thing. There is a second theory, one that the author Kate Summerscale makes a compelling case for, in the suspicions of Mr. Wiltshire. What if Constance did commit the murder, but did not act alone? What if her brother William, 14 at the time, her closest confidant, the only one who had run away with her when the household became unbearable, was there that night? And what if Constance's confession, 5 years later, was designed not to reveal the truth, but to shield the one person she loved? William, in 1865, was about to turn 21, about to inherit his share of his mother's money, about to be free. A false or partial confession, one that said, "I alone did this, no one assisted me," would draw every eye away from William at precisely the moment he needed it most. That missing night dress, that single, vanished piece of evidence. If it belonged to someone else in that household, if it pointed somewhere other than Constance, do you begin to see? The open question still has no answer. But what happened next, in April of 1865, changed everything. The 25th of April, 1865, London. Bow Street, Magistrates' Court. A woman entered the building accompanied by an Anglican clergyman, the Reverend Arthur Wagner, and the Lady Superior of the Brighton convent where she had been living. She was 21 years old. She had been living quietly, piously, seemingly penitentially for nearly 5 years. She handed a letter to the Chief Magistrate, Sir Thomas Henry, and she asked to be charged with murder. I, Constance Emily Kent, alone and unaided, on the night of the 29th of June, 1860, murdered at Road Hill House, Wiltshire, one Francis Saville Kent. Before the deed, none knew of my intention, nor after of my guilt. No one assisted me in the crime, nor in my evasion of discovery. Now, remember that night dress, the night dress discovered on the morning after the murder. The garment Constable Urch found hidden inside Road Hill House. The stained garment that Superintendent Foley dismissed and that subsequently disappeared from all official record. Constance, in her full confession to Reverend Wagner, a confession that Wagner gave partial testimony on in court, citing the seal of sacramental confession for everything he refused to repeat, indicated that she had used a night dress, that it had become stained, that she had taken steps to conceal it. But here is what makes the blood run cold. Constable Urch's nightdress was found in the morning of the 30th of June, before Constance had any opportunity to have hidden it. She had been under observation from the moment the body was discovered. If that nightdress was Constance's, it was already gone from her possession before the search began, already hidden by someone else, someone with access to the house, someone who knew exactly what it was and what it meant, someone who never faced a single question under oath. That nightdress was never produced in court. Wagner refused to reveal the full content of Constance's confession on grounds of the confessional seal, causing a national scandal over whether a priest could withhold evidence from the Crown. The questions he refused to answer were never asked again. And the man who drove to Trowbridge that morning, who arrived back, knowing more than he should, who hired his daughter, the best barrister money could buy, who was never examined, not by the coroner, not by the magistrates, not by Scotland Yard, died in 1872. He took whatever he knew with him. Constance stood in the dock at Devizes Assize Court and pleaded guilty. The judge sentenced her to death. Queen Victoria commuted the sentence to 20 years. And Jonathan Wiltshire, the detective who had been right from the very beginning, whose career had been destroyed for his accuracy, was dead by then. He never saw the vindication of his life's great case. Blimey, if ever there was an injustice dressed up as justice, there it sits. There was no trial, properly speaking. Constance pleaded guilty, and the court accepted her plea. There was no examination of evidence, no cross-examination of the family, no interrogation of the circumstances surrounding that missing nightdress, that too-knowing father, that nursemaid who had quietly vanished. The public reacted with a confusion that mirrors our own. Harper's Weekly, 1865. It does not appear to us that the Road Hill murder has become any the less mysterious, even now that Constance Kent has confessed. Constance served 20 years at Millbank and later Fulham Prison, not as a broken woman, as a disciplined one. She trained, she studied nursing. She maintained, by all accounts, a composure that unnerved even the prison authorities. She was released in July of 1885. She was 41 years old. The following year, she left England. She sailed for Australia, where her brother William was already living, the same William who had run away with her as a child, the same William she had always fiercely protected. She changed her name to Ruth Emilie Kay. She trained formally as a nurse. She worked on a leper colony. She served in a home for young offenders. She lived quietly, competently, usefully for nearly 60 more years. Constance Kent died in New South Wales in 1944. She was 100 years old. She never in all those years contradicted her confession. She never elaborated on it. She never named another person. The secrets of Road Hill House died with her. Here is what sits at the very center of this case and what makes it far more than a Victorian curiosity. Jonathan Wiltshire did everything right. He examined the evidence with a rigor that none of his contemporaries matched. He identified the most credible suspect with the earliest, clearest logic. He was honest when honesty was costly, and the system, the magistrates, the newspapers, the well-connected father with his well-paid barrister, the respectable England that simply could not bear to see one of its own families dragged into the dock. That system crushed him for it, because that is what systems do when the truth is inconvenient. Constance Kent may well have killed her half-brother. She confessed it. She maintained that confession until her death, and there is enough evidence. The missing nightdress, the laundry discrepancy, the intimate knowledge of that house in darkness to make the case compelling. But whether she acted alone, whether her brother stood in the dark that night and helped her carry a sleeping child out into the rain, whether her father's urgent drive to Trowbridge that morning was a desperate man putting distance between himself and what he knew, those questions were never answered. They were never asked, not properly, not formally, not in a courtroom under oath, where the answers could not be made to disappear like a blood-stained nightdress handed to a superintendent who decided he knew what he was looking at. What we're left with, 165 years later, is the outline of a crime. The confession of a woman who may have been telling the truth, or telling the partial truth, or sacrificing herself for someone she loved, and the unmarked professional grave of the one man who came closest to the real answer. That's the queer business at the heart of it all, isn't it? The right man knew, nobody listened, and the wrong people walked free. If this case has stirred something in you, if you believe forgotten crimes deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Victorian Dark Mysteries. A new investigation drops every week, and if you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different. Constance Kent walked into Bow Street Court in April of 1865 and handed over a confession. She told them she acted alone. She told them no one knew, no one helped, no one suspected. And perhaps that was the truth. Or perhaps it was the most disciplined act of love and the most devastating act of silence in the history of Victorian crime. We'll never know. The house still stands in Road, Wiltshire. They renamed it Langham House, as if a name could bury a thing that deep.